Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko in Houston, Texas. And today, really excited to be speaking with somebody I've known for a while from Houston, Texas. That's Fady Joudah. Fady is a doctor, an activist, and an incredibly acclaimed poet as well. Went to the University of Georgia and then the Medical College of Georgia. Currently an ER physician and volunteered with groups like Doctors Without Borders. Also, I think it's important to note, Fady is Palestinian, and we'll be talking about that. Just a little bit of background. I could spend 30 minutes just going over your CV. In 2006, Fady translated Mahmoud Darwish's The Butterfly's Burden. And then in 2009, If I Were Another, also translation. And then in 2017, another Darwish translation, The Silent That Remains. On his own account, in 2007, won the prestigious Yale Series for Younger Poets competition for his collection, The Earth in the Attic, and has put out several collections of poetry, including Alight in 2013, Tethered to Stars, which I have here in front of me, which came out in 2021. And then most recently, a book we were just discussing, how to describe the title, either brackets or ellipsis, or and that came out in 2024. And that was shortlisted for a National Book Award. Also in 2024, Fady won the Jackson Poetry Prize. He's received all kinds of honors and acclaim, like Guggenheims and other things like that. So thanks for talking with us. Really appreciate it, Fady. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start. I think it was an interview, just kind of a generic thing, but this is interesting to me. I think I brought it up to you before. You said, for me, poetry is a form of activism, and that word enables the labelers and also gives them a rash. So I just wonder what you like, kind of what the role of poetry is in all of this.
I think that poetry is the role of poetry in as you say, in all of this in quotation marks is the same as the role of anything else that insists on common decency in the darkness of the spectacle, really, in which we live. And it also depends where this poetry is. Poetry in Arabic, or Palestinian poetry in Arabic, at one point in time, during this sort of mass mobilization of Palestinian society toward revolutionary being in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and it trickled, and it still trickles as a mass mobilization during the height of the PLO days. The poetry was also making a culture more complete and resisting the erasure of Palestinian culture and in Arabic against the hegemonic world of frankly of English, where spectacle is made sort of as a capital essence, as a capitalist essence of how to dominate culture. Palestinian poetry in English, I tend to, in which I partake, is a little different, I think, because, you can't really, or you can up to an extent, engage the beast, if you will, in the middle, the belly of the whale, with poetry as something that contributes to a revolutionary culture or a culture of mass mobilization in the US. Because what you need is community for a radical tradition to actually persist. And Palestinians do not have a community in English. And in fact, one would say, nor do Arabs. And if you want to conflate that to extend it to, it would be a conflation to Muslims, I would say that we're still in the process of being manufactured as a community in English. But specifically speaking, Palestinian poetry in English as a thing that engages anti-commodification succeeds in that, ironically, because it does not have a community. It seems to me that in America, whatever has a community is likely to be co-opted in a matter of time, if not instantly, into the production of the spectacle. And Palestinians, paradoxically, Palestinian literature, Palestinian voices, doesn't have a community to produce any mass mobilization in America, and at the same time, that affords it the paradox of remaining relatively protected from commodification. It's kind of a strange bind, really. So because of that, I say that, the role of poetry is as simple, as small, and as necessary as any act of common decency that wants to stand against or insists on standing against the sort of the routinization of brutality against any people, and in this case, the annihilation of the Palestinians.
Let me just do a quick follow-up, Scott. Because what you just said kind of made me think of something. Like I'm listening, obviously, reading your poems and listening when you recite them in English, and I receive it a certain way, and I have certain preconceptions politically and whatnot. How do you kind of assume that this is being received in Palestine, for instance? Is poetry like a form of resistance? I was thinking, I think I mentioned this to you, like when I talk about the Vietnam War, I actually read a lot of Ho Chi Minh and poetry, because that's kind of how he kind of like early on in his life kind of reached out and let people know what he was thinking. And so like in Palestine, what is I would assume your poetry means something different there than it would to me.
I actually can simply say it doesn't mean anything in Palestine because I don't write in Arabic. I translate from the Arabic. I engage with Palestinian writers or poets who write in Arabic. But I think that, perhaps if I were to tweak your question, I would say, what is Palestinian poetry in Arabic? And what is Palestinian poetry in English? And I kind of already addressed this. And I don't think Palestinians who are writing poetry in Arabic need my poetry per se. Except, as readers who are writers who would engage with other, textualities and contextualities of the Palestinian experience or the diasporic experience. But I think that, I would also caution against always thinking of the Palestinian cultural production of the narrative of the collective self as always a political engagement. Going back to your quote, remind me to get back to it. Because I think Palestinians also are interested in as anyone else, in their hourly lives, without which they would not be able to produce other forms of collective life. And so Palestinian literature, like any other literature, remains intent on insistent on its continuity with a tradition that goes back 1,500 years, which is the Arabic literary tradition, and will continue to go on. So it's really not that simple to think, or it is, to think of Palestinian literature as something that is just geared toward sort of, the revolutionary and the political in the sense of, producing mass mobilization. So going back to that quote, it really is a quote about like giving gives those people an excuse and a rash. I guess I was facetiously saying it because this is the conundrum or the paradox we cannot escape in the US, in the hegemonic English, as a lingua franca, as an imperial language, that once you are deemed to be an outsider, you are subjected to all forms of categories, even within forms of solidarity that are not necessarily cohesive or generous or even honest in the way that they can see you as a full human being. You're already put into a labor sector, if you will, as a poet, as an ethnicity or so forth that fits the production of the spectacle in a certain way to keep feeding culture, which feeds the system itself. So in a way, I feel indifferent sometimes to how I am received or I am read, because I think ultimately art teaches us that in the end, as a dear friend of mine said, and not morbidly speaking, that one is really always in conversation with their future dead self. This is what remains, I think, of art, a future language, even if it is written so deeply and so deeply immersed in the present. The present sometimes seems to have such futurism to it. And by that, I would say, I was just looking at an essay I'd written in 2012. That's nearly 13 years ago, after one of Israel's wars against Gaza. And the title of that essay, "A Poet from Gaza Will Rise and Win the Nobel Prize." And so that little satire in that, in which the cultural production of the image of the Palestinian in English, it was very clear to me that, that far back. And of course, it was clear to many, many more Palestinians much farther back already, in how the image of the Palestinian is produced. So that, for example, I could be a lauded artist or poet, but it is totally okay that my people are totally annihilated. Because, they will love me because I really honor art. And so this kind of conundrum is of course macabre, I think, and deserves nothing more. And maybe that is even too much. The spectacle doesn't deserve even that kind of sardonic title. A poet from Gaza will rise and win the Nobel Prize, and I guarantee you it will happen. With the way with the way the culture making or a culture industry keeps working. So just give it enough time. In that essay 13 years ago, I say 30, 40 years. So we've got 20, 30 years into it. So we'll see what happens.
And, Palestinian artist won the Academy Award this week for a documentary for No Other Land.
Right. It's a fascinating thing, to have, for example, a place like Hollywood, that was and remains just sort of like the New York Times, for example, or whatever, a major contributor beyond complicity, an active contributor in the dehumanization that permits the erasure and annihilation of the Palestinians, of the sort of veneration of Zionism, and and then suddenly there's this moment of the Oscar as if somehow it's reflective of the capacity. It's sort of self-revisionism and all this stuff. And it is really, I think it's very difficult. People want to say, well, it's all good and anything to get more people on board and to open more eyes and whatnot. But at the same time, I think it really neglects how the system constantly pivots and and readjusts in order to rehabilitate the forces of darkness when they have to acknowledge that they have stepped into the darkness a little too far, even for their own good.
They won't even get a U.S. distributor. Hollywood gives them the award, but then they won't distribute it in the U.S. So
Right.
it says a lot right there.
Right.
I was going to shift a little bit and talk about your book, which is you call pictogram, and I think other people have called it ellipsis, which is I just read it over the last few days. It's a wonderful book. And you wrote that after October 7th, 2023. And I'd just be curious to hear about what it was like to write it. I think I read another interview that you had read it actually in a pretty short time. And I'd just like to hear a little bit about what it was like to write that book post October 2023.
I would say the first 3 months after October, October, November, December, I think probably felt like 3 years for so many Palestinians. And so there was a kind of the alertness and the hypervigilance of being alive. And as I say in the long poem at the end of the book, dedication, to those whose bodies and memories and imagination are my body, memory, and imagination. And there's this awareness, a physical, an actual physical and spiritual awareness that we are such an extension of each other's bodies as Palestinians, no matter our location on earth, as I say in the poem. And so I don't think that I was aware of the time passing when I was writing those poems. But I can say, as I've said before, that the reason I think I composed that book, not all the poems some of them were like sitting in my files already, but I composed it in about 6 weeks. I think I even am generous. The more I think back to friends to the time that I was writing it, I think it was all done in 4 weeks, really. Is that I had already written the book in a previous time. Now, as a Palestinian, you live with this in a way, in a world, and I called it in some other interviews, the Cassandra complex. You live in a world that doesn't believe what you say and what you see, but you're neither mad, crazy, nor visionary or a prophet. It's a simple truth. You're always watching your attritional annihilation, your attritional genocide for decades. What your parents and grandparents had told you was not some kind of a hysterical event. Their sense of the horror that they endured at various years and since the Nakba in 1948, the inception of Israel, again, was not some exaggerated event, but you learn to negotiate it, you learn to resist it, and you start developing a different relationship with time about it. And then you reach a moment. I reached a moment about 20 years ago, I would say, where I remember having a conversation with a dear friend, and I said to him that I don't think that the Western world will come to any meaningful awareness, if that, about the Palestinian question before a genocide is committed against the Palestinians. And he said to me, what do you mean? I said, it'll have to be a massacre of like 20, 30,000. And to be fair, I was thinking that it would actually befall the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, who are within historic Palestine, or what we call 1948 Palestine. But whatever, I'm not in Vegas. So here we are. It befell the Palestinians in Gaza. And it might accelerate its form in the West Bank, and it might still happen later on to the Palestinian citizens of Israel. So what I'm trying to say is that all those poems had already been felt, experienced, engaged with on both intellectual and spiritual level, and I had no more to lose, just to let them out in the sort of language that I did in the book. And I feel that the book was already ahead of me, and now it's really I'm done with it. I mean, it's if one's to speak of a Palestinian presence through also my right to art, and to insist on my existence as someone who's also interested in producing art and culture, then this is a book that, as a book of conversation with culture and art, that I have written, and I have to think of ways to move on from. Even though the genocide, I cannot move away or move from the genocide, because it is still unfolding. It is, of course, fascinating how so many people are writing about after Gaza. And invariably, there is no Palestinian writing about after Gaza. It is always someone who is not a Palestinian and who is a self-proclaimed pro-Palestinian, or recently ex-Zionist, become anti-Zionist or whatever. And it shows the extent with which everybody is invested in the rehabilitation of Zionism in ways that appeal to power systems, so that they're not left out in the cold. They need to maintain their privileges in the system, in the name, of course, of opening more eyes and expanding the conversation and whatnot. But it is not how a Palestinian thinks.
In the spirit of that, to follow up in the idea of after Gaza, because in the last, well, really since Trump, even before that, but since Trump's taken over, we've seen kind of a real yo-yoing effect, right? Where one day he allegedly forces Israel to agree to a ceasefire, and then he's talking about a Riviera on the Gaza. What do you think this means in the region, in Palestine and in the region? It looks like it's kind of galvanized various states there to stand up to Trump. I mean, is that really happening? Getting American media obviously is very different. So just kind of, what do you think of what's, especially in the last month or so, the kind of up and down, kind of vertiginous flurry that Trump has kind of inflicted on the region?
I mean, I guess one has to take it seriously. However, I think that one thing that we don't focus on is the agency of the Palestinians themselves. The Palestinian people are not going to let this happen, whether Arab, governments state this way or not. And I think that's the primary issue. What I find problematic is that the assumption that the movement from genocidal Joe to psychotic Trump is somehow it's like everybody is forgetting about the spectacle in the movement, that everybody is now attacking Trump for declaring the normalization of ethnic cleansing with mass forced displacement. When none of those people ever said a word about the genocide that the Biden administration actually approved and facilitated and administered. So it is hard for me to take the American conversation around Trump's declarations seriously, because I am aware that all American offices and administrations are okay with the continuation of the liquidation and the annihilation of the Palestinian people in one version or another. Just imagine that the Biden-Harris administration had won, or Biden, was able to run again and won again, or that Harris had won. It is laughable to me to think that they would really be somehow putting a better end and a quicker end to the genocide than what is happening. You know, I don't know what will happen, but I just know that, you know, it's obviously tragic beyond belief in a way that we're also limited as Palestinians to speak in English. You know, one is governed. I was speaking with another professor here in Houston about how sorrow, grief is not permitted for me to address as a Palestinian in English about what's happening. And and my friend raised the point, and my response was in part because grief and trauma, pity and sad stories in America have already been part of the spectacle. America will pick up on that in a heartbeat and advance certain Palestinian voices as long as all you're talking about is advancing pity and grief and sorrow. It's not even honorable grief and sorrow. So I would like to honor my own grief and sorrow by maintaining it at a private level, because the public engagement of grief and sorrow in America is an absolutely, I mean, again, it's almost a red light district at times. No offense to those who have to work that hard life. So yeah, it's very hard for America, as I've said before, it's very hard for American culture to really surrender to what a Palestinian has to say, to truly listen, to begin the process of listening to what Palestinians have to say. It is ironic also that I think Palestinian freedom has come to represent to much of Western culture or society the downfall of Western society. How ironic it is that an elderly Palestinian man at the beginning of the genocide in late 2023 says, satirically again, wow, I had no idea we the Palestinian people are that powerful, that the entire Western world is attacking us to defeat us. And I really, you know, I really think it's hard for people to accept that. This is not me looking for exceptionalism, that you know, Palestinians have become to represent, you know, I'm sure there is, but I guess the sword of Damocles or something, the thing that will just, you know, upend Western freedom or Western society or Western civilization. It's neither true, it's psychotic, is really what it is. And it's incredible narcissism at that level of psychosis. You know, to perform the atrocity and then to want to be comforted for performing the atrocity.
It's mind-blowing. One question I have in all of this, and you actually have a poem about this in the book, is around hope. And a line from the poem is, "Hope left me, but it isn't true." Where do you see hope fitting in with all of this for Palestinians or anyone in support of the Palestinians?
I mean, you know, what is hope? What is empathy? What is redemption? All these words that you know, what is love? That you know, we struggle with as human beings. I mean, hope for Palestinians is to remain alive, and to persist as a society that is able to gather around a very rich and diverse cultural presence within themselves, within the Arabic tradition, which is part of world tradition, you know, Islamic or Christian or Jewish for that matter. You know, I'm a believer in time. We may think we conquer nature, but we can't conquer time. that's my primary hope. It is tragic, of course, that, and unspeakable that so many people have to go through so much suffering. And that, we always say, but it happens. It happened to so-and-so, and it happened to so-and-so, and look, here they are. And I find no comfort in that. I mean, Bob, what is, like, I want to turn this around and ask you, what is the final word on the American genocide of Vietnam?
It's much of it's been whitewashed, and in the effort to give the Vietnamese agency, they've kind of written the Americans out, which means they've written out, if 3 million people killed and tons of bombs and all the other kind of stuff. And in retrospect, kind of the U.S. has gone in there. It's kind of Trump's vision. I thought of that when Trump mentioned the Riviera thing, because that was kind of the Vietnam strategy. 30 years later, they go and they kind of win the war with capital and investment and multinational corporations and things like that. And so when Trump mentioned that, I thought, well, that's what happened in Vietnam, kind of.
Yeah, and I think that, again, the problem for Zionism and Israelis is that they have been in denial for a long time. I mean, even this notion that there was a better Zionism before, and now that it has gone off the deep end, is also problematic for me as a Palestinian, because the justification of the horrors that the entire Palestinian people endured in 1948, that this was done by better Zionists, that it can be explained, it is entirely nuts. It is entirely part of the spectacle. That's why I said to my friend 20 years ago, it will, if it does, have to take a genocide that sort of appeals to Western perception of mass massacre, like 40,000 now. Who knows? Who knows if we'll even find out what the numbers are? And by the time we find out what the real numbers are, nobody, everybody would have looked away into some other domestic spectacle, as it is the end of morality on U.S. soil. So yeah.
To kind of ask sort of along those lines, one thing that all of us have been talking about is this kind of increasing repression, which we've seen. But and I think all kinds of activists of different stripes are in the crosshairs. But obviously, Palestinians clearly are, because it's not just Trump or the Republicans. I mean, plenty of Democratic governors have done this too, right? Using these allegations of being pro-Hamas terrorists to kick students out or fire professors. Have you seen personally? Have you kind of experienced any of this, or people and have you seen it, this intense? And you've been doing this a while. You're very active in the Houston community. But and obviously, I think Palestinians are clearly in the crosshairs more than any of us. But it's happening in a way that I don't think I've seen before.
Yeah, you're correct. That it's happening in a way that we haven't seen before, haven't seen, at least as far as the imperial domesticity or domestic scene since Vietnam. But I also think that, a friend of mine said at the beginning of the genocide, as if, and I quote her, as if we have forgotten what they did to Iraq. So you're talking about a way in which an entire machine, of propaganda that makes a society feel that if you march 1 million or 2 million people against the war in Iraq, that wasn't going to reverse anything except retrospectively. So everybody writes their books about Guantanamo and reports and wins Oscars and Pulitzers. Then this somehow restores our sense of soul and brings us one step closer to redemption. But what has happened in the whole process is that it normalized the point that where a genocide takes place, and whether you're up in arms about it or not, that nothing stops the genocide. And I think that because we are directly complicit in a genocide and actively involved in it, it makes the repression that much fiercer. because I think so much depends on the maintenance of the image that this is okay to do to other people. If we say it's okay, if the system sells it to the American public that it's okay or that it is debatable. So that's why I think the fierceness of the repression is remarkable. And I am not really sure, like there are moments when I say, oh, the American public is going to really be bitter about this, how suppressed they were and violated and so forth. I am not sure anymore. I think that it has happened before, and we ended up, being swept into the spectacle of the technification of desire. You end up just being seduced by the things that you need that you don't really need. I mean, it is one of the tragic things for me that in America that even the conversation around race contributes to the commodification of the spectacle, which is a separate thing from saying that there is no racism, because there is, or there is no injustice anymore. There is, but the way that it's employed is really about a conversation with power, the halls of power, and the commodification of it as a trigger to mobilize people toward manufactured consent. And I think this has to do with, this is the example we're living with, like the movement from Biden to Trump. It's I remember, Chomsky saying that in America we think that the range of the freedom of speech is so massive because it is raucous within a very narrow framework. So all this noise is just within a framework this narrow. They will not, otherwise you're threatening national security with your freedom of speech.
It's shocking, obviously, to see a genocide. People react so casually to it that's being live streamed. But I guess it's shocking. But after 2020 and the response to COVID, it's not as shocking, I think, right? Do you see this kind of it's not just on issues like Palestine, which has all kinds of context and nuance to it, but I think kind of American society just be kind of more accultured or inured to this kind of violence and this kind of casual approach to the loss of life. I mean, is it bigger than that? And do you think COVID, because you're on the front lines as well, one of the interviews I saw with you was during COVID, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that's really made as a layman, I think that's made a huge transformation in America, a very bad one, right? I just wonder if you've seen anything like that.
I don't know that I'm not going to dismiss what effect COVID had.
You have the anti-vax stuff, everything, the mask, the anti-vax.
Yeah, but I don't know that we were. I mean, you're going to tell me that the reason we weren't that moved by the genocide in Rwanda was because it wasn't live streamed, or that the absolute horrors that have been going on in Sudan for decades, yeah, in various parts of Sudan or Congo, was because of there's no TikTok there.
Right.
So I'm not entirely sure. I do agree that yes, there is an element to where, the hyper visualization, that hyper visualized world that we live in normalizes violence and horror. So much production, even cinema and all the horror movies and the war movies and the video games, and it's been talked about a lot. I just insist that it has a lot more to do with the fact that it is us who are committing the genocide, and that we have a vested interest in committing the genocide. So we may not be committing, or may not have committed the genocide in Rwanda directly, or even indirectly, but we did not do anything about it. But we don't even have a vested interest, sadly. in the Rwandan people or the Congolese people. We just leave it up for vultures and multinational corporations to get what they can. And we don't care about the chaos, which is shocking, because you would imagine that there is the relationship we would have to a decimated people who are African, like the Congolese, would sort of mobilize us more. And this has not happened. I don't care what anyone says. It has not happened. In fact, I remember distinctly, because I was with Doctors Without Borders at the time, that initially there was an interest in what was happening in Darfur at the turn of the century in 2003 and on. But mostly, I realized, was because there was an angle that tried falsely, and once it realized it couldn't be true, it stopped its interest, to try to turn it into a racial thing. So it was Arab versus African, and it turned out that, oh, wait a minute, it's a lot more complicated than this, and this can't be just put into some kind of a service of a racial divide that serves an administration like George Bush's. And then that just went away, and the people in Darfur and the entire people of Sudan continued to suffer, unspeakable catastrophes, and still to this day, and hardly anyone talks about it. So I am not really sure that it is simply, this conversation about the live streamed COVID, the isolation, et cetera, is really that primary of a contributor to our numbness. I think that it is, the system, the imperial system did learn from Vietnam, and that it has to sort of allow dissent, but as long as it is relatively a meaningless dissent. And yeah.
I think we're close here, and I can't tell you again how much I appreciate this. But I just want to talk a little bit about your poems, and you can maybe even discuss this or read it or recite it or whatever. But there's one that it's about your daughter finding the spider web on her bike, and it's really touching. And I just wonder if you wanted to kind of mention that, discuss it.
Yeah. Let me. Yeah, it's a poem I wrote around the time that I wrote that essay. A poet from Gaza will rise and win the Nobel Prize. So it's about 12 or 13 years ago. Mimesis. My daughter wouldn't hurt a spider that had nested between her bicycle handles. For 2 weeks, she waited until it left of its own accord. If you tear down the web, I said, it will simply know this isn't a place to call home, and you'd get to go biking. She said, that's how others become refugees, isn't it? And that poem received a lot of attention and continues. And in the new book, so this was in my second book called Alight, I wrote another mimesis poem, also brief, and I'll read it. This morning, I don't know how, an inch-long baby frog entered my house during the extermination of human animals live on TV. I recognized the baby's dread. It leapt into shadows, under the couch, into my shoe. My son was watching. Gently, patiently, I followed it on my knees with shattered heart and plastic bag, coaxed it, caught it, released it into the yard, and started to cry. I had been affected by a strong feeling, that not many people who loved the first poem, it was almost like again, the spectacle. It was almost commodified into a catharsis moment. And very few, if any, the people of Bangladesh, when I was in Bangladesh and I read it, and the audience loved it, and big poets from the Bengali poets came and talked to me about it. They were aware of certain mysticisms in it, and also its relationship to Islamic folklore, for those who know, because it has to do with Muhammad the Prophet's escape from Mecca and hiding in a cave that was sealed by a spider web and so forth. And so he was a refugee then, right? He was forcibly displaced. But then, I realized that many still don't make the connection that when you justify the destruction of homes for people, you're also potentially manufacturing consent to actually annihilate them later on. And then and I was the one watching this happen within me and within my people, against my people, for all this time, while I also have to contend with how moving the poem is, so to speak, while for millions of people it is a devastating reality.
I had one more poem question, which is about the first poem in the Pictogram book, which is the opening line actually really struck me, which is, "I am unfinished business. That business did not finish me or my parents. Won't leave my children in peace." And I'd just like to hear a little bit more about that, because it's sort of close, I guess. It sort of really it was just really impactful on me when I read it.
Yeah, no, I go back to, I think this is in a way how the poet in me converses with larger, historical narratives without being didactic. I'm not a scholar, and really it is a conversation with being a human being, the experience of a human being as subject to review, whose humanity is subject to review. In this case, the Palestinian, and the relationship to the history of Zionism, as I mentioned earlier, that wants to convince us today that the Zionism that destroyed Palestinian society and culture in 1948 was okay, was a kinder, gentler Zionism. Whereas today they have gone off the deep end. Whereas in fact, it has been a continuous project that had its internal push and pull, sometimes because of moral concerns, but often only because of political will to navigate the project further, until you get to a point where you realize Zionism will always face itself in the mirror as a project of annihilation of the colonized, and so it is really that simple to say this. The rest of the poem, as you're aware, and you answers also your question about hope that you asked me earlier, because I do insist in the poem, on my right to be an artist and to find my freedom as a Palestinian with my people in that futurism. I am unfinished business. The business that did not finish me or my parents won't leave my children in peace. In my right hand, a paper. In my left, a feather. To toss, to quill, to meet my terminal velocity. I forget Palestine has a kind way of remembering those who mark it for slaughter and those it marks for life. I write for the future because my present is demolished. I fly to the future to retrieve my demolished present as a legible past, to see what isn't hard to see in a world that doesn't. I also think of my children because I think of my childhood. And I realized that my parents, up to an extent, were trying to protect me from bearing the anguish of growing up Palestinian in the world. And then you realize that even no matter how much they protected me, there were external events that forced this kind of anguish on me. And then I realized I was doing the same thing with my children. At least I grew up in the Arab world, so I was much more connected. And then you realize that a genocide happened and my children can't, Palestine has marked them for life too. But hopefully it is the sustenance of life.
And this has been fantastic. I really appreciate it. In my own teaching, I use poetry a lot. And lately I've been thinking a lot about things like Brecht in class not long ago. I read To Those Born Later and Wilfred Owen. So, what you're doing, I think has, really real meaning, and I really appreciate it. Always look forward to talking with you, listening to you talk, reading your newest work. So thanks so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. You're very generous.
I mean, it sounds cheesy, but like talking to people like you and to others who are out there doing things is really important these days, because it's pretty easy to feel, kind of isolated. So really appreciate what you do for us.
Thank you. Thank you. You're generous to have me on. And I see, but I appreciate it.
Just a quick outro, folks. We've been talking with Fady Joudah, poet, physician. And if you like what you hear, and please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to, if you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. And if you really like us, go to greenredpodcast.org and hit that support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been great. And everyone else out there, make trouble and misbehave, and we'll talk to you again soon.